My name is Craig Hill, and I'm here as an optimist and a realist and a big believer that business could be used as a force for good. And I'm here today to ask you a question. What is the purpose of business? On its face, it seems like a pretty simple question, but I want to dive into the rabbit hole for a moment and say why I don't think it's quite as simple and why I think business has a lot of room for growth when it comes to impact. So let's just think about it for a moment. The most simple answer to that question of what is the purpose of business is that businesses are owned by shareholders. And the job of every business manager is to return profit to shareholders. That's it. It's pretty simple at its core. Make money to return profit to shareholders. It's a pretty simple lens, right? So there's been a legal and social impacts that have been erected to make sure that these values of shareholder returns are ensconced within the very actions of every business in our country. Starting with the legal framework. Let's go back to 1919, 100 years ago. Our friend Henry Ford of Ford Motor Company decided that it was going to be time to raise the wages that he paid all of his employees while simultaneously lowering the cost of the vehicles they sold. That idea was not so that he could just not return any money to his shareholders. The idea was to employ still more men, to spread the benefits of the industrial system to the greatest possible number, and to help them build up their lives and their homes. It's a pretty lofty statement. And at the cost of that lofty statement was no dividend for the shareholders that quarter. And they didn't take very kindly to that idea. In fact, they sued Mr. Ford and the Ford Motor Company, shareholders did, for their wrongly denied return. And long story short, they won. And the Ford Motor Company was ordered to pay a dividend to their shareholders. And the result of that case law still stands to this day. The idea that the purpose of the corporation is to make money for shareholders, and that the defendant in this case was arbitrarily withholding money that could go to the shareholders by a dividend. It's from casebriefs.com. And Dodge v. Ford has been cited thousands of times in the past 100 years as the basis for what has been known as shareholder primacy, that the concerns of shareholders come before all other outcomes, be they social, environmental, you name it. So as this legal framework's been erected, we also have a social framework that's followed suit. The idea that a business's only job is to return money to its shareholders. And we as a society have bought into this idea. Here's a graph. It talks about this idea from a Forrester Analytics consumer study. Folks 70 and over, only 20% of them answered the question in the affirmative that said, the business that I work for and businesses I buy from, their values matter to me. And only 24% of folks ages 60 to 70 and 34% of ages 50 to 59 answered affirmatively to that question. And in many ways, it's given a rise to the idea of the nonprofit sector as part of a binary with the for-profit sector. That if you wish to be working for impact, you need to work for a nonprofit. Your values can be respected, but you're probably not going to make as much money. And if you want to work for a for-profit company, it's probably going to mean you're going to have to check your values at the door. We as a society have really celebrated this idea in ways that we may not even be aware of. It's creating this idea that a corporation is now rationally behaving in a way to make sure it returns all these profits possible to a shareholder regardless of the long-term consequences. It becomes rational to use single-use plastics, for example. This idea that it's cheap to produce and costly to dispose of, but the company doesn't have to pay for the disposal of that product. Similarly, if a company is going to employ someone, it makes sense to employ them at low-cost, low-benefit work because you're going to be returning all of those profits to your shareholders the next quarter, or being used to grow the company further to hire more people. So this idea has created a situation that's rational in each individual instance. But unfortunately, while it may be rational to pursue that profit in every individual instance, perhaps it is irrational in the aggregate when you start looking at the long-term effects and taking a long-term lens to these ideas. While it may be rational to use single-use plastics as a business because you don't have to pay to dispose of them, it's exceedingly costly when our oceans are filling with garbage islands the size of the state of Oregon. The idea that our landfills are filling at record rates with unusable and unrecyclable products. And the idea that low-cost, low-benefit work, the cost doesn't fall to those businesses. It falls to us, consumers and taxpayers and governments, to deal with skyrocketing wealth inequality and social injustice and healthcare crises. So people are starting to recognize that this rationalized behavior may be irrational in the aggregate and are starting to demand more from businesses to be accountable for all of their outcomes. Let's go back to that Forrester Analytics study, but taking a look at folks who are under the age of 50. Gen X folks who are ages 35 to 50 said 45% of them put those values central to where they work and where they buy, and 68% of millennials, who are folks under the age of 35, are saying that, yes, I need companies I work for and buy from to align with my values. And, well, millennials make up 38% of the working class, so that's not a huge number. It's a plurality, but it's not a majority. But by 2021, millennials are going to make up 50% of the working class. And by 2030, millennials and youngers are going to make up more than 75% of our working class. Those are huge, huge numbers. Again, 38%, 50% by 2021, and over 75% by 2030. So what does this mean? It means that we're caring about these more and more as society ages into the working class and consumer class. But not only that, this survey was taken in 2015. The exact same survey was taken again in 2018. And every single age demographic answered in a higher proportion than previously, stating that, yes, the companies I work for and buy from need to align with my values, including over 77% of people under the age of 35 saying it was a necessity. So as we think about these data sets, this rationalized irrational behavior in an era of climate disaster that's coming down the pike in the next 10 years, healthcare crises and wealth inequality around every corner. There's presidential debates going on that are talking about these very facts right now. How do we start dealing with these challenges when we have legal and social frameworks in place designed to protect shareholder primacy and thinking about values only as in, what can I return to my shareholders? Enter BCorp Certification. Started as an idea. What if we measured all outcomes of a business, not just the financial ones? And let's create metrics that measure profit, and the same way we measure profit and loss, that we could start measuring social outcomes, environmental outcomes in the same way, so we could metrically measure companies that are doing a better job of taking care of all of its stakeholders, not just its shareholders. The B Impact Assessment is standardized to 200 points, right? So you have every single company, regardless of size or scope, basically takes the same version of the test, and there's 200 possible points. There's no penalties for wrong answers. There are no wrong answers. 0 points is a legally operating company in this country. But instead, we have the idea that for every action a company takes that's beneficial to those other outcomes of people and planet in addition to profit, you can be awarded points. What are some of the points on offering? For example, let's think of, do you have policies in place to ensure gender pay equity in your company? Do you have policies to measure your carbon footprint and paths and plans to reduce the amount of carbon you're producing? Do you have LGBT inclusive healthcare packages? The idea is that you can employ more people equitably and deliver returns to all of your stakeholders. And you need 80 points to get certified as a B Corporation. And you don't just get to say, hey, I have 80 points, here we go. Instead, you have to submit your assessment to B Lab. And they do a rigorous third-party audit to say, yes, this company does actually pass this test with 80 points or more, and they get certified. But it's not a permanent certification. It's a 3-year window. So the idea instead is that it's not just a point in time you are a company that did a nice job. It's as your company grows and new metrics evolve that we could say these are actually best practices and roadmaps you could follow to have better outcomes and impacts, that your company is going to have to consider those every 3 years as you recertify. It's a powerful opportunity for a business to be looking at ways that we could do our jobs every day better and treat the environment and people with the same respect that we treat profit. But there's shareholders out there that may be concerned, and plenty of business managers say, hey, I don't want to lose my job by taking some actions that may not return benefit to my shareholders. Enter benefit corporation legislation. It's an idea that a company can incorporate at the state level and signal to their investors and their shareholders that, no, we do care about other bottom lines than just profit, and we may take action from sometimes that gives the people on the planet a say in how we do things. And there's now 36 states that have benefit corporation legislation, and there's 5 more that are in process and expected to pass this year, and the rest of the states are currently working on it. The idea is you can incorporate and celebrate your values centrally and say, we do have some other metrics in place to protect you and signal to your shareholders that, hey, you can make decisions that may not be always in the idea of making the most money today. But as we have more and more companies thinking about this, it's important to think about the fact that there's now 3,000 certified B corporations since 2007 when the first company was certified. and even more remarkable than that, is there's over 60,000 companies currently taking the B Impact Assessment. These are record numbers. It's huge opportunities where businesses are thinking critically about how they could do well by doing good. But as many of these companies start to juggle these challenges, they start recognizing that, hey, perhaps maybe the way we've made money historically that was profitable for our shareholders may have been unprofitable or damaging to our stakeholders, like our planet and the people who've worked for us and the consumers who buy from us. How do we reckon with those challenges? How do we think critically about what we're going to do? Do we need to change our business model to face these challenges? And while many companies are thinking through this, I want to think of an example of a company that's been leading the way in many ways, Patagonia. Patagonia makes and sells clothing. It's what they do. They sell apparel, right? And they did a carbon audit in 2017 as part of their B Impact Assessment. And they asked themselves, how much of our carbon is from our supply chain that we emit? And of the millions of tons of carbon they emit every year, 97% was from their supply chain in creating clothing and selling it at market. And instead of ducking it, which they are totally allowed to do, and burying that information, they were transparent about it and published exactly how much carbon they were emitting and pledging that by 2025, that supply chain of carbon was going to be mitigated. They were going to mitigate or capture their carbon from every single facet of their supply chain, becoming a carbon neutral company by 2025. And critically, they were going to publish how much carbon they mitigated every single year. And in 2018, that was 51% of the carbon that they produced, they've risen to. And this year, 69%. They're on track to beat their own metrics to 2025 to becoming a carbon neutral company. But not only that, they closed their stores with pay for all of their employees on election day to ensure that they could all have a chance to vote and have a say in our democracy. They took out full-page ads in the New York Times and covered subway stations across New York with a campaign that said, we are facing extinction due to climate change. Climate disaster is a reality, and we need to vote in politicians and folks who are going to take action around this idea. These are fiscally costly investments, and since Patagonia is not a publicly traded company, we don't know just how much they spent on these ideas. But the old standby for the purpose of a corporation of making money, Patagonia has quadrupled their revenue in the past 5 years. And this year, they're on course to make over $1 billion for the first time in their company's history. So they're not making this money in spite of these actions. Instead, quite the opposite. You don't have quadrupling growth in a 5-year period without significant stakeholder buy-in to what you're doing. They're not succeeding in spite of this. They're succeeding because they're acting with a purpose. This is the new paradigm that I believe that the purpose of business lies in. That business needs to have a purpose. That we need companies acting with a purpose central to the very way they make their money. And if they're having challenges in doing that, looking hard at why those challenges exist. We need to be building a shared and durable prosperity for everyone. And we need companies to be working harder to make sure they're not contributing negatively and making messes Monday through Friday that all of their employees and management are having to clean up on Saturday through Sunday. This is the new purpose of business. And you don't have to just ask me or the 3,000 B Corps out there or the 60,000 prospective B Corps taking the assessment. The Business Roundtable is now taking up this idea that stakeholder inclusion matters. The Business Roundtable is a collection of nearly 200 CEOs of America's largest companies. And if they're America's largest companies, they're the largest companies in the world. Amazon, Apple, Chase, Salesforce. Their CEOs got together and released a statement this summer that said that stakeholder value was the most important thing their companies could be focusing on doing individually and collectively, even more so than shareholder value. And while you can imagine that B Corp CEOs were very excited to hear these words coming out of the largest companies in the world's mouths, they also wanted to see actions paired with those words. They wanted to see people take concrete action, become a benefit corporation. Use the B Impact Assessment to measure all of your outcomes. And the slogan in their rallying cry was, let's get to work. Indeed. We're recognizing that we need a historic culture shift within the way we consider business if we're going to have any chance of solving these intractable giant issues that face us. They're not going to be solved unless we take critical action every single day in where we work and where we spend. So let's get to work. Let's get to work ushering in an idea of stakeholder-centric capitalism, one that companies succeed by doing well by doing good. Let's get to work on supporting companies where we spend our time and our dollars with those who align with our values and encouraging companies that don't to do more. And let's get to work on ushering in a new era where we think about what the purpose of business is and that business should have a purpose. Thank you so much.